Good afternoon. I'm ashamed to say that in 2009, just 7 years ago, I knew absolutely nothing about the 1988 prison massacres, and I had written the book, Crimes Against Humanity, the textbook in English, into its 4th edition. I had been a United Nations judge, a president of a war crimes court in Sierra Leone. I was a judge in England, and I didn't know, like most, all international lawyers outside Iran, about this most wicked crime. And I'm going to tell you exactly how wicked it is. Late in July 1988, as the war with Iraq was ending in a truculent truce, prisons in Iran, crammed with government opponents, suddenly went into lockdown. All family visits were cancelled, television and radios switched off, and newspapers discontinued. Almost every prisoner, and there were thousands of them, who had been jailed for adherence to the MEK. The delegation had but one question for these young men and women, most of them detained since 1981, merely for taking part in street protests or possession of political reading material. And although they didn't know it, on the answer, their life would depend. Those who, by that answer, evinced any continuing affiliation with the MEK were blindfolded and ordered to join a conga line that led straight to the gallows. They were hung from cranes, 4 at a time, or in groups of 6 from ropes hanging from the stage in an assembly hall. Some were taken to army barracks at night, directed to make their wills, and then shot by firing squad. Their bodies were doused with disinfectant, packed in refrigerated trucks, and buried by night in mass graves. My conclusions as an international judge is that this, without any reasonable doubt, is a crime against humanity. It has been a crime, it has been a ordered by the Supreme Leader, supported by the President, who is now the Supreme Leader, and carried out by a set of officials. One, of course, was Rafsanjani, but others, hundreds of them, who are still in the government of Iran. One of them, the most vicious member of the Death Committee, was a man called Paul Mahmoudi, who I gather is the current Minister of Justice. How extraordinary. What are we as a world where we cannot punish a crime of this magnitude, a crime of this evil? We punished the Japanese. We punished the Serbs. Now it's time to punish the mullahs. We cannot, as international criminal lawyers, we cannot, as a civil world society, we cannot, as the United Nations, look ourselves in the face if we allow this worst of all crime, the mass killing of prisoners, to go unpunished, where those who carried it out are still profiting from it by their positions of power in Iran. Now, why didn't we? Well, I looked at that, and I have a chapter in my book about it. At the time, there was a special rapporteur for Iran, and at the time, Amnesty International, the New York Times, The Guardian, they did have some awareness of it, although the bodies were buried at night in the places of the damned in the various cemeteries. the word got out. 800 corpses here, 800 there. There were snippets of information came out. And the UN rapporteur, who was a naive and incompetent professor from a Latin American country, Professor Pohl, did at least notify the General Assembly that large numbers of people seemed to be disappearing from Iranian prisons. Professor Pohl, believe it or not, went to Evin prison where he was greeted by a band that purported to be prisoners, just as the Nazis misled people who were coming to investigate the concentration camps. Then he met some alleged prisoners who were actually actors, who told him the food here is wonderful, it's delicious. And the wool was pulled over his eyes. The Iranian regime played him for the booby that he was, and he never even asked to meet Ayatollah Montazeri, the man who had desperately asked to meet him. And he went back and did nothing. And so the 1988 massacres slipped from the world's mind and from human imagination. They conned the United Nations, and that is why the United Nations now, that these horrific events have been revealed, has a duty to make good its failures in 1988. It has a duty to do something, and I'll tell you what it should be doing about the 1988 massacres. Firstly, a proper investigation. I've done mine, and I've listed a number of people who I believe should be jailed for life for this crime against humanity. But I think the Human Rights Council of the United Nations will be best placed to set up a prosecutor. You can set up a special prosecutor. You can set up, and the UN Security Council, in my view, has a duty to set up a special court, what they call an ad hoc court, like the court we have for Rwanda, for the genocide there, like the court we have that is putting Mladic and Karadzic on trial. A special court like the court in Lebanon. This can go ahead without the defendants. In the case of crimes against humanity, you can try people in absentia. And the supreme leader of Iran, who is a mass murderer, must be tried. So there is no question that the law, international law, requires their trial. International law that requires a trial for this crime against humanity. So why not demand it? You can also actually, once the officials who participated in this at death committee levels, at lower levels, the prison governors who ordered the stringing up, there were all sorts of officials at different levels. They can be identified, we know, but they should be identified by Human Rights Council investigation. There should be a court set up by the Security Council, an ad hoc court, to try them for crimes against humanity, for a prosecutor to gather the evidence. And then, of course, they can be prosecuted wherever they are found. If they dare to venture abroad, a number of countries in Europe have what is called universal jurisdiction legislation and can put them on trial. They should not be allowed diplomatic immunity. If they venture abroad, they should be found. They should be listed by Interpol with red notices, captured and put on trial wherever in Europe they could be found. Because, firstly, we can't progress as a world society unless we do something about the worst unpunished atrocity in modern history since the Second World War. That's the first reason. And secondly, what happens when you let criminals go? What happens when you don't prosecute? You have no deterrent effect. And the fact that the United Nations turned a blind eye towards this dreadful crime encouraged them to go further. There were 160 assassinations. After the Ayatollah's death, there were 160 assassinations in Europe of Iranian oppositionists, their deaths ordered by a death committee headed by the current supreme leader that met in the Turquoise Palace, one of the old palaces of the Shah. And that's what will happen if these people are not prosecuted. Well, we've got to stop Iran getting political advantages unless and until those whose hands are bloodied with a crime against humanity meet some form of justice. Unless they are prosecuted for a crime against humanity, international law, international criminal law, will have no force. There is a moral and legal imperative to begin that process. Thank you.